going to talk about some personal background on Flannery O'Connor. So, Flannery O'Connor was born on March 25th in 1925 in Savannah, Georgia. Her parents were Regina Klein and Edward F. O'Connor. She had kind of a rough teenage years. Her father ended up dying of systematic lupus when she was only 15 when that happened. But while she was early on in school, she demonstrated her literary skills and talents really exceeded others. She showed a lot of promise in that area. She just began in the city's parochial schools, and the family ended up moving to Milledgeville, Georgia in 1938. She continued her schooling there. After high school, she got a scholarship in journalism at the University of Iowa. She was going for her master's degree, but after just like a year there, she realized that she didn't want to be a journalist. She didn't really like journalism, so she switched to writing. And while she was there, she published her first short stories. It was the Geranium. That was actually a collection of a lot of short stories, and that was her thesis for her master's degree that was published in 1946. And while she was in school, she also started to publish her first novel. She didn't publish it, but she started writing on it. Wise Blood. It ended up getting published in 1952. She ended up graduating in 1947. And then after Wise Blood was published in 1952, she submitted that to Yaddo, it was in Saratoga Springs, New York. It was an artist retreat. That's where artists and writers, they would go there to get inspired and learn more about things to do. And her submission of Wise Blood got her into that. After that, she moved in with some people that she met there, Sally and Robert Fitzgerald in Ridgefield, Connecticut. She lived there for about 2 years, and they were both very, very strongly Catholic, and they introduced her to that religion, and that really influenced her and her decisions, and that in turn influenced her writing. A lot of her writings really were influenced by her experiences growing up. And so, like, as a Catholic in the South, that really that really affected her writings. It influenced them a lot. And religion was a really recurring theme in her work. A lot of the main characters were actually preachers of the South and just of everywhere. She was best known for a lot of her short stories. There are multiple collections. A Good Man is Hard to Find and Other Stories, that was published in 1955, and Everything That Rises Must Converge in 1965. So she did write novels, but she was best known for her short story collections. She was a very strict and disciplined writer. Each morning she would always get up and write and she would have very high expectations of herself. So in 1950, she was diagnosed with lupus, just like her father. I think it was a different kind of lupus, but even like in those times, she was very demanding of herself. Unfortunately, after battling lupus for like 14 years, she died August 3rd, 1964, in Milledgeville, Georgia, where she grew up for a lot of years. She received many honors, including an O. Henry Award in 1957. That was like the one that she got while she was still alive. After she had died, she got the National Book Award in 1972. In 1992, she was inducted as a honoree to the Georgia Women of Achievement, and in 2000, she became a charter member into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame.
Hello, I'm Dylan, and I'm doing Good Country People by Flannery O'Connor. This is my first time doing a video recording for a project, but we'll make it work. And I'm just going to be highlighting the story. So here we go. So it starts off with Miss Freeman. The first paragraph is all about Miss Freeman, how she's a stubborn woman. She knows what she wants, and it's very evident that she doesn't think that she's ever wrong. And it seems like she's the protagonist of the story, but then it quickly jumps to Mrs. Hopewell. And Mrs. Hopewell, it's evident that she has money, and she has three daughters named Joy, Glennice, and Caramel, which Joy calls them Glycerin and Caramel, which is kind of funny. And it kind of seems like Joy does not really like the two younger daughters. Maybe that's because they're either better looking or they're not as intelligent, because it goes later on, the story goes to talk about how Joy has her PhD in philosophy and that she's just a highly educated person. But also she had her leg shot when she was a kid, when she was 10 years old, and so they had to amputate it somehow, and then she was walking with a fake leg. But overall, the story, it was about this family, and it's very interesting to see the mom, Mrs. Hopewell, and Joy's dynamic. Joy obviously doesn't really like anyone or anything. She's obsessed with philosophy, and she loves just her own thoughts, it seems like. And she always seemed plagued by the ignorance of other people, while Mrs. Hopewell, her mom, was kind of annoyed that she was so kind of on this intellectual superiority complex, where she knew everything, and she wasn't able to bring herself down to a practical level. But she hired Mrs. Freeman and Mr. Freeman because they were the only people available. And Mrs. Freeman, from what it says, was that she talked a lot, she got all up in your business, and she definitely had some issues, which contrasted Mrs. Hopewell, because Mrs. Hopewell seemed to be always the woman of character, the woman who had a little bit more dignity and maybe integrity, doing the good thing, doing the nice thing. I guess that's why it's called Good Country People. Um, but Joy changed her name to Holga when she was 21, and she did it just to annoy her family and kind of do it as this kind of like this cynical joke at, oh, I hate the world. But anyways, one day this guy comes and he's selling Bibles, and his name is Manly Pointer, I'm pretty sure. Yep, Manly Pointer. And he's selling Bibles, and at first he seems like this extremely innocent man, and he comes and he just wants to sell Bibles, which they've sold Bibles before. But it's evident that Joy, it kind of takes an interest in him at first, because yeah, she's being very cold and hearted, but I'm pretty sure in the story, maybe I'm wrong, but she is the one that's like overhearing and keeps on looking at him and then looking away. And so uh, Mrs. Hopewell invites him in for dinner because he doesn't really have a place to stay, and he's really nice, and he's trying to sell these Bibles, and he said he sold 72 with 2 more on the way, and just a really innocent, nice young man. So they had dinner, and he was obviously at the dinner, kept on talking to Joy and seemed very infatuated with her. And so when he's leaving, um, Joy walks him out to the gate, and then at the gate she says, "Hey, let's," or he brings it up and says, "Hey, let's have a picnic tomorrow. Let's go through the forest. Let's have a picnic." And so that's what they do the next day. But that night, Joy actually, because he was so innocent and she was an atheist and he was a Christian, she had this kind of sick fantasy of kind of twisting his like seducing him and having sex with him, and then bringing a lot of shame to him, and then showing him, hey, this is the real world. It's not as pretty as it seems, to kind of bring his innocence down a little bit. And so the next day, she meets up with him. They go. Mrs. and Miss Hopewell and Mrs. Freeman stay at the house, which Mrs. Hopewell was kind of suspect of Joy, because she went out with him, and Joy is just not a talkative. She's very rude. So she was kind of wondering what was going on. But so the next day, Joy goes out and meets him, and they go down, and multiple times he kisses her, and she's just not feeling it at all. She's weirded out by it. She's never done this before, and she doesn't know what she's doing. And then they go to this barn where they both get up there, and this whole time, Manly Pointer, the 17-year-old kid, is just in head over heels in love with Joy, and just kind of this innocent little kid that seems like he hasn't done anything with his life. And so he keeps on kissing her, and then he says, "Oh, like, I'm in love with you. Do you love me?" And she didn't say anything back. And then he said, "Oh, well, if you love me, you take off your leg, because this is how much I love you." And so she takes it off, and then he like keeps on asking her to take it off and put it on, take it off and put it on, which she was kind of weirded out by. And then he puts it to the side, and he says, "Hey, now all you have is me. Now you just have to trust me." And this was like the first time she's ever let herself go for anyone, and it was really weird for her. And the whole story was just really, really interesting and really weird. But she finally lets herself go, because in her mind he's this extremely innocent man. But then he opens up his briefcase, and there's only 2 Bibles in there, and the rest is a deck of cards and vodka. And she realizes that he's not this goody two shoes. And then in a span of what seems like 5 seconds, he turns into this menace. And he's not a good country people anymore. He's this guy that's trying to steal, that either just have sex with her or steal something from her. So at the end of the story, what happens, she feels very uncomfortable. She pushes him off. He steals the amputated leg and puts it back in his suitcase, and then leaves her, and she's just there to fend for herself. And it seems like she's kind of dazed. The author makes it seem like she's kind of dazed and she's not really doing anything. So she just lays there. Her glasses are off because he took her glasses, so she can't really see anything. And he leaves saying, "Hey, I'm not as innocent as you think. I'm innocent. I'm just like you, where I have this cruel kind of perspective on the world." And she like realized how she got played. And then he goes back over the hills, and Mrs. Hopewell and Mrs. Freeman see him, and then comment how much of an innocent man he is. And the exact quote, which is just extremely ironic because they have no idea that he just did this to Joy. But Mrs. Freeman saw him. Mrs. Hopewell said, "He was so simple, but I guess the world would be better off if we were all that simple." And then Mrs. Freeman said, "Some can't be that simple," she said. "I know I never could." And that just shows that they had no idea what was going on, and that this good country person that they thought he wasn't at all, and that he was just a bad guy stealing things. And he said that he had stole things from other women from different locations. And overall, it was a really interesting story. I never knew where it was going. I kind of had a thought the entire time that this guy was bad, because he just seemed too innocent. He seemed too, quote unquote, perfect and Christian. He had no problems. But at the same time, it was very interesting to see how much innocent he was, and how he played such a good part at that role. Overall, it was a great story. I liked it. It was a nice read, and it was cool to see the dichotomy between Joy and her mom, and then the dynamic between those two, and also the dynamic between Mrs. Freeman and Mrs. Hopewell. But overall, it was a good story.
In my reading of Good Country People, I found 4 themes that I felt were very important to discuss. The first theme that I found that I'd like to discuss is identity. A person's identity is how they view and interact with themselves, the world around them, and the people that they come into contact with. This is different for everybody, which is why everybody's identity is very different. However, sometimes people go through identity shifts, and it changes everything about their identity. It changes how they view and interact with themselves, how they view and interact with the world around them, and how they view and interact with other people. We see a very clear example of this in Good Country People through our introduction of Mrs. Hopewell's daughter, Joy. Joy starts off seeming kind of normal, kind of chill, and then she goes through a complete identity shift and becomes Holga, who how we know her for the rest of the story. Holga is so different from Joy that we actually never see the Joy aspect of her personality come back at all. But Holga luckily shares a lot of the same views as her mother, Mrs. Hopewell, who actually is the reason why theme number 2 comes into play, which is the theme of social hierarchy. The social hierarchy, or social classes, whichever way you want to call it, used to be the way that we decided everything in society. It used to decide who you could spend time with, what events you could go to, what jobs you can get, where you could live, what cars you could buy. Social class dictated all of that. In Good Country People, Mrs. Hopewell is the decider of all of that. She created this kind of class system where rich landowners, which is her, is the top of the food chain. They're the large and in charge people. And then there's everybody else, which are the people who can be employed. And those people are separated into 2 different subclasses, which are the Good Country People and trash. We're never really given clear examples of which type of people those are. We just know that the trash are the ones you really want to avoid, and Good Country People are still just, below you if you're a rich landowner. We see a really great example of how the upper class interacts with the lower class, in how Mrs. Hopewell interacts with Mrs. Freeman. Because Mrs. Freeman is below her, Mrs. Hopewell spends all of her time verbally abusing her, despite the fact that Mrs. Hopewell needs her more than even her own daughter, in a sense. But it doesn't matter, because all of them have some kind of religious view of some sort, which is how our third theme comes into play, of religion. Religion is played out really differently in the story, though. We have a devout and very devoted atheist in Holga. She is portrayed the way usually a person of belief would be portrayed, but she is very proud and very committed to her atheist views, which is then contrasted by some kind of wishy-washy Christians. Her mother, Mrs. Hopewell, is actually one of those Christians. She doesn't believe or care for the Bible. And then the next Christian that we see is Manly, who just uses the Bible as a meal ticket, which is very different than how usually people of religious beliefs are portrayed in stories, but that was the way Flannery O'Connor wanted to portray it, and I think it's kind of funny. And then the theme of religion plays into our next theme, which is the theme of questioning existence. As in life, our story kind of goes around all these characters who are struggling with or kind of accepting their role in life and why they are where they are. Manly, for example, he's supposed to be bringing faith, but people can't look past his outwardly appearance, and so he tends to struggle with what it is, like what his existence and what his meaning of life is. And then we have Holga, who was Joy but is Holga. Holga views life as meaningless. I'm convinced it's partially because of the fact that she has a PhD in philosophy, and also because of her identity shift, but she sees life as meaningless, and which is what kind of leads to her interactions with Manly and really just plays along with the whole story. These 4 themes are seen throughout the story, and I hope that you enjoyed Good Country People as much as I did.
Hey everyone, welcome to my portion of our presentation on Good Country People by Flannery O'Connor. Today I wanted to kind of tap into the historical context of the 1950s, leading up to the publication of the story by Flannery O'Connor in 1955. All right, so Good Country People was written in a genre known as the Southern Gothic. Now, Southern Gothic literature was inspired by early Gothic writing, a genre that was popular in the 18th century England. In Gothic literature, the authors wanted to expose the problems they saw in society. All right, now let me get into what was happening in and around the 1950s. I am going to talk about 6 major things that happened around the world before the year of 1950, which was the year that Good Country People was publicized. In the 1950s was seen by the world as the first decade in 20 years to be kind of the recovery decade. So we saw in the 1930s, which was the Great Depression. In the 1940s, World War I raged across the country, but also across the world in Germany and Poland and all those other countries. So the 1950s really was seen as a time to recuperate from all that. It was war-free, as I read in a couple of writings or articles. So yeah, let's start in the year 1950. Okay, on June 17th of that year, Dr. Richard Lahr performed the first organ transplant using a kidney. Also in that year, U.S. President Harry S. Truman ordered the building of the hydrogen bomb. Okay, moving on. 1951, during the month of June this year, the first color TV program was introduced by CBS. 1952. On February of that year, Princess Elizabeth was thrown into the responsibility of ruling England at the young age of only 25, after the sudden death of her father, King George VI. In December of the same year, the Great Smog of 1952 occurred, which was a severe air pollution event that caused deaths of breathing issues numbered in the thousands. In the year 1953, Cambridge University scientists James Watson and Francis Crick published a paper in the scientific journal Nature announcing the discovery of the double helix chemical structure of DNA. In the year 1954, on January 26, Jonas Stocks invented the polio vaccine, and during all of this time, it was given to 1.8 million children in a massive field trial. All right, we're getting to the year that our story was publicized, 1955. During this year, the civil rights movement began with the August 28th murder of Emmett Till, the refusal on December 1st by Rosa Parks to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, and the subsequent Montgomery bus boycott. So that is just a couple of things that I really found interesting about the 1950s leading up to 1955, so I hope y'all enjoyed.